Good evening and welcome. The time is 6 p.m. I'd like to call to order the November 18th, 2020 Keizer Planning Commission meeting. Debbie has noted attendance. For the record, we have two attending via phone call, Commissioner Saldivar and Commissioner Watson. Second order of business tonight will be the approval of the October 2020 minutes. If we can go ahead and get a motion on those minutes, please.
So moved.
Second.
Okay, we've got a motion by Commissioner Callier and a second by Commissioner Grentz to approve as presented. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Appearance of interested citizens. It doesn't look like we've got anybody signed up. All right. Moving right along. I guess just a piece of housekeeping while we're doing the meeting tonight, please keep your masks on. Should have said that earlier, I apologize. This will be what we're dealing with this evening, and then the council is doing the same thing, and we'll be discussing some additional protocol a little bit later during the staff report, I imagine. So. We do have a public hearing tonight. This is an amendment to Keizer Development Code, text amendment case number 2020-17, to consider proposed revisions to the Keizer Development Code to amend section 2.313, accessory structures and uses related to the design standards for accessory structures. I will open the public hearing at 6:02. Mr. Witham, Mr. City Attorney, if you would please provide the staff report.
Thank you, Chair Lawyer. So tonight we have a text amendment for the accessory structure standards here in Keizer. So things that govern, outbuildings, garden sheds, all of that. This was one of the identified items on our work plan from back in January. It's kind of been on the list of things to do some housekeeping on, and we thought this would be a good opportunity to tackle those issues. Staff report kind of outlines put some bullet points in there on what we're proposing to do with the language, and then I think they're minimal enough changes. I think we'll go ahead and just walk through the section when we get there, and I can kind of explain as we go why we're making the changes and what kind of reasons led us to this point. What drove this originally is that historically there's a lot of desire to have larger accessory buildings than maybe we allow. And, from an overall planning perspective, we've talked a lot at Planning Commission about the needs that Keizer has for buildable lands. We don't have a lot. Housing needs. And one of the reasons that accessory structures are limited in size generally is that large parcels have more redevelopment potential than small parcels, clearly. And if there's an allowance for extremely large accessory buildings to be planted in every large backyard, it can prevent the overall land supply and the stock that's available and possible to be redeveloped in the planning horizon. So we're not proposing any changes to that, but one of the things that historically has happened in Keizer is somebody may come in and say, well, I have this need for a larger shop, I collect cars, I like to do woodworking, whatever it may be. And frankly, I tell people, I said, yes, and find a house that has a big shop because those are worth a premium. But one of the workarounds is that we don't limit the size of an attached garage. So if somebody wants to build a 3-car garage or a 4-car garage, they can do that because it's considered part of the home. Obviously, there are some differences in tax assessed value and building code issues and connections. And one of the things that's been difficult is the code has never really clearly defined how, quote unquote, attached a structure has to be considered part of the home. And when people try to kind of, I'll say, skirt the intent of the code, there's been a lot of, I don't like to use the word arguing, but if somebody's witnessed me at the counter with customers, sometimes that's what it ends up devolving into. And in the past, Nate, our former community development director, kind of just would wave his Nate wand and make determinations on a case-by-case basis on when things were attached enough or not. And this was one of those items that I'd kind of begged Nate, can we put this to bed once and for all before you ride off into the sunset? Because it's a real difficult thing to kind of struggle with when I have somebody coming in saying, well, why can't I do this? And I don't see why I can't, and yada, yada, yada. So what we are proposing primarily is to kind of clarify what an attached structure is versus a, breezeway or a, I've had people say, well, I'll just put a 2x4 up and connect it. And we're like, no, that doesn't work. That's not the intent. So that was primarily what triggered it. But in the process, I reached out to our staff, and Dina was instrumental in this. And Dina's with us here tonight to make sure frankly, that I don't say something that's inaccurate. But so I'm glad that she's here to keep me in check. But we also talked to our other staff in the office, and over the years we've had several questions that have come up in different areas, and some areas that maybe there was what we would not consider ambiguous, but other folks may consider ambiguous. So we're trying to clarify those things. So with that being said, if you guys want to turn into the actual text with the red lines, I'll just kind of run through them real quick, and then as you have questions, feel free to interrupt me. I'm used to it. That's what happens all the time at my house. So hey, no big deal. So kind of looking there on page 1, the first thing, and this came out of the fact that we've adopted accessory dwelling unit standards and modified those, as some of you know, multiple times over the last few years. So we wanted to very clearly state that an accessory dwelling unit is not the same thing as an accessory structure. So that first sentence we added is to bring that clarity into play. And interestingly enough, when this text amendment went out, I actually got an email from kind of a housing watchdog group that look at affordable housing and housing issues. And they were very interested and wanted to provide public comment. And then when I explained, no, this isn't accessory dwellings, this is accessory structures like garden sheds. And then the gal who had reached out to me said, oh, okay, never mind. A lot of cities have had this issue where they may say ADUs are allowed, but because of their accessory dwelling or their accessory building standards, there creates this conflict, and then people are limited and unable to build an accessory dwelling unit if they have a shop. So we wanted to clarify that an accessory dwelling unit is different. So that's kind of in the very first paragraph, that's why that's in there. And then dropping down to bullet point C, the way we have applied setbacks for a very long time, and I think in 2016, we actually modified our setbacks and reduced them a little bit, because there's a lot of small structures that are already right up on property lines, and there's structures that don't require building permits. So we have a chart currently that basically says, hey, if you have an 8-foot wall, that can be right up to a property line as long as it meets building code, fire code kind of issues. And then as that wall height increases, the setback will increase on kind of a 1-to-1 ratio. And the issue is that generally accessory buildings are not built with flat roofs. So you'll have a wall with a gutter that might be 8 feet, but then you'll have a gabled peak, and that peak height will be much higher, much taller, and there'll be a much bigger mass that's facing a property line. And we're trying to clarify here with this language that, hey, when you have the larger tall wall with the peak, that whole height is what we're going to measure as it faces the adjacent property. So if you've got a 12-foot peak and that's up against your back wall, you're not going to be able to put that at 0 feet because the wall height that's facing the other neighbor is only 8 feet. You need to put that 12 feet back, the additional setback, so that it's not looming as much on the adjacent property. So we added the little language that clearly says the setbacks are going to be applied to each face of the building according to its height. The other thing in that section down at the bottom, we added some language that says regardless of whether or not there's additional setbacks to a property line for the alleys, because that's been a bone of contention in certain neighborhoods that have alleys, because some alleys are right-of-way alleys and the property line is right there. Other alleys are more like an access easement, or sometimes people own to the middle of an alley. And clearly we can't have an accessory structure within an alley area that's intended for people to have access through. So we wanted to clarify that. And then that last sentence in there is intended, well, it's intended to clarify the issues of really corner lots is mostly where we've seen it come into play. We have a standard in just our regular zone code in the residential zone that says yards adjacent to a street, you have a minimum setback of 10 feet. And that's primarily driven for houses, because accessory structures have its own set of setbacks around the board. They're not subject to the setbacks of a house, which is, 20 feet for a 2-story, 14 feet for a 1-story for rear, and 5 feet for sides. So in the case of a corner lot, we would run into some scenarios where there was definite ambiguity as to, well, how close can my accessory structure to be if I'm on a corner lot, but my corner is actually my rear yard? And because of how we regulate fences, which is we essentially say, hey, your fence doesn't have to be 10 feet back from the sidewalk on your side yard and rear yard, we do make it be 3 feet back currently if it's a 6-foot tall fence. And so what we've added is some language to say, hey, in the case of these corner lots or a yard adjacent to a street, that in no case, regardless of what the chart says, in no case could that accessory structure be any closer than a fence would be allowed to be. So hopefully that makes sense, but that's why we added that language in there. So then getting down to subsection D, this is really what drove the need for the text amendment. We tried to clarify that, yes, you can have a breezeway, but if you have a breezeway, it's still an accessory structure. And then further down, we talk about what it means to be attached to the primary dwelling. And so we are basically saying, hey, in order for this to be considered part of your house, it needs to be attached by a common wall and or habitable space. So you have to be able to walk in that new addition all the way into your main house, just like you would with an attached garage. So that's what that language is trying to get at. And then it also clarifies that those types of additions need to be compatible with the existing home. And that's driven by a very specific property that I went round and round with years ago that did an addition, attached it with a common wall, and basically built a metal pole building as their attached large 3-car garage. And there was nothing in our code that would give us the authority to say, no, you need to match your existing home. And I got lots of calls about that one when that went up, and a lot of criticisms. And so that was one that's kind of been a long-standing, and at least when you worked here as long as I have, you have some of those things that just stick around and kind of bother you. So that's why that language is there for that subsection D. And then in E, added 3 whole words, the sum of all accessory structures on the property. That is not a substantive change at all. It's the way that we've always applied and interpreted the standard. However, pretty recently we had a property owner who already had a detached outbuilding, and their representative happened to be an English teacher, I guess, and we had a lot of discussions about sentence diagramming. And, it's been like 8th grade since I did sentence diagramming, and I said, hey, look, I'm not going to argue the merits of the English language. I will tell you this, our city attorney reviews all of our language as we adopt it. This has been a long-standing standard, and I'm telling you right now, no, we're not going to approve an additional 600 square foot building when you have 2. And the argument was, well, it'd be really nice if there was just something in there that made it really, really clear. It could have been as simple as saying the sum of all structures. And I said, you know what? I don't disagree with you. And this is actually a section that's on our list to revisit. And when we revisit that, I am making a note of that. And I had a handwritten pencil note in my development code to add that language. So that's why that's in there. So there is I didn't think there was a question before, but now I think there is absolutely no question that it is an aggregate total sum for the size limitation of the 600 square feet. And then when we get into sub F, this one does have a little bit of a shift of what we've applied in the past. As you can kind of see, previously we said that horizontal lap siding, well, that was for metal. Basically, you could have metal siding if it was horizontal lap metal siding. And what we've run into over the years is a lot of argument on what that exactly means. And kind of your standard standing seam metal siding that you commonly see with pole barn construction, where you have basically a flat panel and a ridge and a flat panel and a ridge, maybe in like 12-inch sections. We had a lot of people, and a few that got approved by previous administration, that they simply turned that siding sideways. So it just looked like a big metal building with the ribs running horizontally instead of vertically, which I don't believe was the spirit of previous commissions or the intent of the ordinance. So we are recommending that we just simply say, hey, no metal siding buildings. And we wanted to clarify about membrane structures, your kind of your Bi-Mart or your Costco tents that people put up. Historically, those have been allowed if they're 200 square feet or less in area, because anything under 200 square feet, the real small sheds, we don't apply design standards to those. We figure they're small enough that if somebody wants to go buy a little, bolt together metal shed from True Value or Lowe's or wherever, go ahead. It's not this big, large garage structure that all the neighbors are going to be constantly looking at anyway. And we kind of took that same approach with the membrane structures, but we never had anything in the code that actually spoke to membrane structures specifically. So we had to kind of get there in a roundabout way and say, hey, those are tarp materials. They're not regular materials for permanent construction. They're by nature a temporary type of structure, which our code really doesn't allow temporary structures. So we treat all structures that are put up that they could be there forever. So that's why we added that membrane language in there. And the other thing I wanted to point out in that, and sorry, I kind of took that a little backwards, but when we're looking at structures over 200 square feet, and the 200 square feet is there because basically that's where the building permit review kicks in. Things that are under 200 square feet don't require a building permit by the building code. So somebody can put up a structure and we will never know about it. But if something's over 200 square feet, they have to actually get a building permit through our department. So we have the ability, Dina has the ability to review those when they come across our desk. And so that's how we get to apply those design standards. And we had one very recently with a lot of, times change, and we're seeing a lot more of the resin type structures that are coming in. And we had one come in, and we've never really seen any larger ones that have needed permits. I mean, I have a small resin structure that I keep my lawnmower in on the side of my house. It doesn't require a building permit, it's just it's a little, 4x6 structure or something. But we had one come in that somebody actually got engineering and plans and wanted to build a larger resin structure. And it was, I can't remember how big it was. Do you remember how big it was?
It was just over 200.
Okay, yeah, it wasn't huge, but it did require a building permit. And the challenge was, as Dina went to review it, she said, Shane, I don't know that this really meets our design standards. And so we looked at it, and ultimately I had to make an interpretation to say, no, I believe that does fit in the spirit of the code. I mean, it had windows, it looks just like wood siding, it has grain in it. It was actually a very nice looking little structure. And so we wanted to clarify that, yes, we do intend to allow those types of structures. So we wanted to kind of bring some clarity to, really, it's an aesthetic more than anything, but what we want to see in the neighborhoods based on what we have heard from other neighbors as structures have gone up. So that's really the crux of what we're asking Planning Commission to consider tonight, and then recommend approval of the language onto council. And with that, I would be happy to entertain any questions you might have.
So the only one that I have, I know of a few folks that own accessory structures that are made with like the vinyl and the canvas and stuff like that, that don't generally apply under the current exterior finish. This would not necessarily preclude them from keeping it, but if they sold it, they would have to go and probably...
Yeah, and it's hard. Chair, Lawyer. It is difficult because I will not sit here and pretend to say there are not plenty of structures that probably don't technically meet our design standards currently. I live in Keizer and have forever, and I know of some structures that probably are larger than the 200 square foot limit that somebody has put up to put their boat under, or an extra car or something like that. And realistically, we do not have an accessory structure police force. My code enforcement officer is plenty busy with real issues to deal with on a daily basis. But when we do get complaints from a neighboring property who doesn't want to look at a 400 square foot huge circus tent that's next to them, we have had to enact and do code enforcement actions on those properties and have had to deal with some of them over the years. So there is, I don't believe anything we're proposing would really change how we would deal with it, even if this language wasn't in there, if that clarifies that for you.
The only reason I asked, I think about the cost efficiency, and some of these larger vinyl things are quite a bit less expensive than going through the process of building, much more expensive areas. And, there's kind of the look, but you also got to be sensitive to the financial piece of it. And, I think the spirit of it is good. I just, it's one of those things, if it's stopping somebody from going out and buying that RV or that boat because now they got to spend, $8,000 or $9,000 to build something to put it in versus a couple $1,000s, that's just something I want to kind of be considerate of. Although having the vinyl or resin that does look like wood, yeah.
And I will offer this at least. I think absolutely, I hear where you're coming from, and I think that is kind of really a policy question for Planning Commission to consider. To put just a little bit of a frame around it, in the building code, Dina, help me if I'm remembering this right, but I believe that many years ago, the building code adopted some standards for membrane structures, and I believe they allow a membrane structure up to 500 square feet without a permit. Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah. So the building code, by its nature, actually allows a larger membrane structure than we historically have allowed from a zoning code perspective. If Planning Commission felt that it would be appropriate to increase that size for membrane structures above that 200 square feet, the one thing I would kind of urge consideration in is if you went larger, I think it would be appropriate to come up with some standards, and frankly, I didn't actually think of it that way. I was thinking of it more from a let's clarify what we're already doing point of view. But if we wanted to shift that and increase that size for those types of considerations, I would definitely strongly encourage Planning Commission to consider some additional design standards to go around those membrane structures. Just because if something doesn't require a building permit already, they often can go up, and if no neighbors care, we don't know about them, frankly. But if neighbors do care, and we have a standard in the code that says it shouldn't be that way, we want to make sure that the standard is clear on what would be allowed. So if we wanted to increase that, I'd want to make sure we were clarifying, if there's a specific height restriction we want to apply to those membrane structures, or specific setback requirement that would be different or something like that. I just think we would want to consider that. But I think your point is well taken, and is absolutely, I've had those conversations at the counter with folks who say, so I can have my RV parked on the side of my house or my boat, and I can put a green tarp over it for the winter to keep the water out, but I can't put this nice white or tan tent structure that's 250 square feet because I've got a 25-foot long boat or whatever. And I have to say, yes, that is correct. So, it's an absolutely valid point of discussion.
I have a question.
Yeah, Commissioner Saldivar.
Is metal siding of any kind not allowed on a residential structure?
No, not necessarily. There is some, I mean, you could do metal siding, you could do metal accents. So yeah, in the RS zone, we have specific design standards, however, for homes with garage setbacks and design features like windows, overall glazing, eaves, porches. So there's kind of a slew of design features that any house that's built in Keizer has to meet currently. But we do not outright prohibit a metal siding from a house.
So the reason why I ask is I understand your point about like the 3-rib, steel that's designed for roofs or pole buildings, but there's products that exist that are similar to vinyl siding, the wood grain that are made of metal. And when I read this, I mean, you exclude any kind of metal product from an accessory building. Is that, but that potentially that metal product could be used to build the home, but you could use that same metal product to build an accessory structure?
Yeah, I mean, I think theoretically you're correct in the way the language is written.
Because you see a lot of that metal wood-looking siding, especially in manufactured homes, older ones.
Correct. That's what I was. I've seen it used in if someone were to purchase a pre-made building that happened to have metal as siding or a part of it. Sometimes I see metal like on the bottom half and to accent. I've seen some really nice designs with brass and stainless steel and even some stainless steel rib-like siding meshed in, but given this, there's no opportunity for that, so it seems kind of restricted. But I completely understand the intent in that you don't want someone to just take a pole building and turn the siding, the 3-rib, 3-foot wide sheet sideways to give the appearance of metal siding.
Yeah, and this is Shane, but I would say that, I hear what you're saying, and I think that if Planning Commission wants to revisit that particular element, we're not opposed to that outright. I think the difficulty always when we're sitting on the permit counter side of things is where that line is, because I can't, as much as I would like to be able to say, hey, I like the way your design looks, so I'm going to go ahead and let you do it, it has to be written in a way that we can apply across the board. And that's what I said. This has been a challenge over the years, and I know that the language that was in there that said metal siding, that's lap siding, is allowed. I think I would be very open to suggestions from the commission on how we could address that. If everybody's on the same page that, hey, we're okay with it if it looks a certain way. But I would want to make sure that we had language that could be defensible, and I'd have to probably defer to the city attorney to make sure that we could get that language at a place where it would be clearly defined and defensible as we're applying our standards. That's really my only concern, is to make it clear for staff and clear for our citizens when they're planning a project. They know what they can do and they can't do when they look at our rules. So, but yeah.
Mr. Keller.
Thank you, Chair. So what's the term residential in character mean? I'm not trying to put you on the spot,
Yeah.
because I want you to have the ability to, for your office to have the ability to set or interpret standards to the betterment of Keizer. So residential in character, we added it at the top of that paragraph, and then we eliminated it when it came down to metal siding and membrane structures. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering if we couldn't just say metal siding and membrane structures that are residential in character shall be or not residential in character should be prohibited, or something like that. Because we tried to make the exception for the horizontal siding that's residential in character, but there could be some vertical. We don't know what's coming down the road.
Sure.
So if we said something like that, where we basically applied the same standard as we have stated above, then we'd be saying metal siding and membrane structures that are residential in character, not residential in character, shall be prohibited. So we're applying the same standard as above. But that only makes sense if you can visualize in your mind what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, and
And
Mark.
I cannot.
No, and Commissioner Hallier, I absolutely appreciate your take on that, and I will say that I questioned whether or not my city attorney would challenge me on that term that was used, because it is somewhat ambiguous. I will say this, in my mind, what we're talking about when we talk about residential in character, I'll give you an example that's come up a few times over the years. We have a ranch house built in the 1950s or 70s or whatever, and they use T111 siding. And they want to build an accessory structure, and they want to put hardy plank lap siding on it, a more modernized product that's very common with new home construction. And many jurisdictions will say, hey, accessory structures need to match the house. It needs to look just like your house. And there's different cities approach it different ways. We've never approached it that way, but in my mind, the residential in character would be similar to the built environment around them. So and again, the metal siding issue has specifically been born out of challenges that we've experienced over the years, and I wrestled with it quite a bit before putting the language in that I finally said, no, this is going to be my recommendation. But again, the metal siding issue is not one that Shane feels is necessary to die on his sword for. But I do feel that it would be important to kind of define out when we're talking about metal siding, what we want to allow. Because I don't think that the standing seam pole building that looks like an industrial building or an ag building is really compatible with most of our built neighborhoods. So, and I don't think there is a membrane structure that you can say is residential in character, because you can't build a house out of tarps. Like, building code isn't going to let you do it. So, I do think that we would want to maybe separate out the membrane structure issue and the metal siding issue, but based on how we were approaching it, to just simplify it and say, hey, you know what? We're just not going to do metal siding anymore. That was why those got grouped together, and it was struck out for the residential and character piece. But if the commission is, concurring that they want to allow the metal siding that is more residential in character, I might have to ask for a little grace or some flexibility to work on some language with your blessing, that we might tweak that before we took it to council, and get the city attorney to help me on that a little.
Well, and I think it goes back to, if you're going to do something like that, is you continue with the term compatible, so that the metal siding has to be compatible with the existing structure, just like you said above.
Okay.
So if the house has hardy plank siding and they want to put vertical standing seam metal on the accessory structure, no, that's not going to work.
Okay.
I'm okay with that.
City attorney, do you have? Yeah, thank you.
So I guess the question is, Mark, when would you ever have a house? You wouldn't have a house unless you had, I guess you could have a house of metal siding, and then you match it. But if you had a house of any kind of normal non-metal siding, how would you ever match up the accessory structure?
With metal, you couldn't.
Yeah, so
Well,
and I guess my point would be,
So let's just prohibit it, not, because I guess, I don't know what the future holds. And if they can make hardy plank out of concrete, they can certainly make hardy plank looking stuff out of metal.
Well,
Maybe
my
it's-
thought goes a step further than that. If they've got traditional looking siding and they can purchase the metal siding that looks like wood and it's painted the same, I don't know what the cost difference is, but if it's a cheaper product and they say, we want to build this, but we've got this material that looks, we can make it look just like our house, it's just going to be metal versus wood.
Is there metal siding that looks like wood?
Oh, yeah.
Is there?
Yes, there is.
Yeah, there is, yeah.
Well, then,
Okay.
I would go back to what Shane was saying is, and if the commission as a whole
I don't think
wants
it's
to allow
versus 74.
metal siding for the accessory structures under these, then just give us some
And
latitude to come up with the language. I didn't really like residential in character either, and I kind of just let it slide. But it is a little problematic. I think the concept is that maybe it's not 100% identical to the existing structure, but it fits in the general neighborhood perhaps, or in
Yeah,
the.
I mean, if you were, if you're 20 feet away, could you tell the difference?
Yeah,
And I guess it gets back to, again, if we're gonna get rid of the residential in character, just get rid of it entirely and just say shall be constructed of material generally compatible with the existing residential structure and wood, stone, brick, da-da-da-da, and then metal siding and membrane, the same thing. Not membrane. Membrane, I'm okay prohibiting. It's just the metal that I'm.
I was just kind of looking as I'm hearing what you all are saying, and again, I don't claim to be an expert on all building materials either. I mean, I dabble, but I'm not a builder by trade. I do look at a lot of plans, but I think that if that was the route, one solution to that would be simply to move the word metal siding that precedes and membrane structures. We could just move metal siding up to the previous sentence
There you
that
go.
said
Yeah,
wood,
vinyl-
stone,
vinyl
brick,
resin,
veneer,
metal siding,
metal,
yeah.
made to look like wood siding.
Yeah.
I think I would still ask for maybe a little deference to allow staff to work with the city attorney on that
Sure.
final language, but if we can come up with something that's in that spirit, is that kind of what I'm hearing from planning commission, the direction to go?
Yeah, that's what I was going to suggest, Shane, and because we don't know what the future holds, maybe we could say metal and/or other materials that are made to look like wood siding.
Well, trucks, for example. Not
But-
to be business.
Right,
you-
plastic or,
But that's resin, actually.
Yeah, it's resin.
the language actually contemplates that, the sentence before, that really is only an example list.
Sure.
And it's probably maybe even should say, for example, because the sentence before just says constructed of material generally compatible with existing residential structure. It doesn't have to be those items. The way it's written, the only thing that's truly and fully prohibited is, right now at least, is metal siding and membrane. You could have anything. That list is not exclusive. So, yeah, I think that is a good suggestion.
Well, I guess the question I would have then, since it's illustrative, does it benefit you guys from these future conversations? If somebody comes in with an illustrative or a material we're not considering right now, you're kind of eliminating that opportunity for folks to be able to do that.
No, I'm sorry. What I was saying is, right now, the way the language is, we lost sight of the first sentence. It says, shall be residential in character, constructed of material generally compatible with the existing residential structure.
Right.
So then the list just says is what's allowed. It's not exclusive. I think what we need to do is just add the words for example, and that's not changing the meaning at all, and then have that list. Because right now it allows anything. The first sentence, it just says compatible with existing residential structure, and then the second sentence says that. Now, I'm not sure you intended that, but that's the way it reads.
Yeah, so, and I guess from just a clarifying point, clearly brick doesn't look like wood, right? It doesn't look like wood. Stone doesn't look like wood. So we say wood, stone, brick, and then the vinyl or resin made to look like wood. And that was to kind of capture those new products that are coming online, like you said, Trex and these vinyl sheds. And I think that if we want to allow the metal that also looks like wood, we can add that to that category. I wasn't necessarily thinking that it was a carte blanche to go anywhere, but I appreciate that because that maybe gives me a little more flexibility than I thought I maybe had.
Or too much.
Yeah, well, obviously that's where the fine line comes in for us from an administrative side of things, is that then when we get into those discussions with citizens that say, well, wait a minute, if I can do that, then how about I do this? Or how about I do straw? Or how about I do, whatever it might be? I wouldn't want it to be so open-ended where we don't give any examples, because I think my experience has been, and not everyone is like this, but my experience has been from a general homeowner's standpoint who's looking to do an accessory building, there's not a lot of homeowners that go out to build a 250 square foot shop or something that's on that kind of smaller end. Now, when they get into the really large ones and they're pushing the 600 square feet, a lot of times engineering gets involved, designers get involved, architects get involved. It's a different ballgame. It's a lot bigger price point also, right? I mean, financing comes into play a lot of times with those. But in the smaller garden shed variety, which is the vast majority of where we have the question marks for people wanting to build a shed for their firewood or their lawnmowers, or in my case, the 40,000 bicycles we have because I've got too many children. That's where I think giving an example list is important so that the homeowner can look at that, or the person who's looking to do the project and go, okay, well, what do they mean by this? Oh, okay, so wood, stone, brick, vinyl, yada, yada. So I wouldn't want us to strike the list completely. I'm not opposed to the for example, which gives some latitude. I am a little bit concerned about leaving it so open-ended that then I'm ending up having a whole new set of discussions that are difficult, however. So.
Yeah, and I was trying to remember, and I saw this going on a walk a couple days ago, and we're talking about metal. Some neighbors got some brand new garage doors, metal garage doors. It's the most beautiful wood I've ever seen. Until you get within about 5 feet, then you realize, oh, wait a second. Oh, that's metal. I was pretty impressed, and I went online here and looked, and I mean, there's a log cabin made out of metal siding. It looks like a log cabin. There's shakes, there's hardy plank looking stuff, there's batten looking stuff. There's anything you can think of that's made out of metal. We just don't use it a lot around here.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think we need to make an allowance for it.
Okay.
And what you were talking about, I'm fine with.
So if we were to add that kind of in the category of the metal and vinyl or resin made to look like wood siding, is that kind of from
Yes.
a consensus point? Is that what I'm hearing? Okay.
Yeah.
Commissioner Grants?
I'm good with giving you some carte blanche authority. I like the fact that in the code, if there is ambiguity, the zoning administrator is the final decision maker. So I'm good with that. Question I have is about the wall height. The KDC does specifically define building height, but it does not define wall height. And I will ask the commission if they want to define wall height as the highest point of the wall or the average height of the wall.
Because not all walls necessarily are going to be the same height in a structure.
Gable
You
end.
have a shed roof,
Yeah.
for example.
Shed roof, gable end roof, yeah.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I will say that just from our administration point of view, the way we have been applying the standard has been the highest point of the wall historically. So if we want to change that, that would be a shift from how we've applied the standard currently. But that, just to clarify, that's how we have been applying it.
So if it was the gutter side, it'd be to the bottom of the gutter?
Yeah. Well, it's normally based on really construction plans. So a lot of times it's going to be
Without the gutter.
It's going to be called out in the plan. So it's going to be kind of your plate height, basically.
Yeah, plate height.
So, what's that?
Didn't we have this discussion a few months ago when we walked down a path? I'm having deja vu that we were talking about this a few meetings back in a different part of the code, building code. We came up with the same thought, because don't we do it differently than Salem, I think.
Well, Salem defines building height as the average
Yes.
between the peak and the gutter.
Yep.
Yes, and we
And we go to the top. Yeah. We go grade to roof line.
What's the advantage to the average? You can have a taller structure?
Have less setback.
You can have
Yeah.
a taller structure, less setback.
Be less setback, sure.
And I will say this, like, I looked at a few different cities and how they regulate heights and setbacks for accessory structures. And it is, again, we've done it a certain way, and I don't personally think our way is broken or wrong. I think it's been pretty easy to explain to folks and all of that. But there are other communities out there, and a pretty common way I've seen folks regulate accessory structures, period. Whereas we're looking at it and saying, hey, we're going to give you an advantage if this wall over here is short because you've got a shed roof coming down. But over here, when it's big, we're going to say push that farther away. In a lot of communities, what they'll say is they'll simply go based on the average height of the structure, and that's what will trigger their setback. So if you have a structure that has a peak of, let me think, 16 feet and a gutter height of 10 feet, then 13 feet is what you use to regulate the setback with, all the way around the structure, regardless of what side is facing which direction. And that is an approach that other communities use. I think that's the approach Salem uses for how they deal with their setbacks. And Commissioner Grant is right, that's also what they talk about for their building height, period. With houses, we also approach things a little bit differently and have historically, where we actually allow, if I live in a 2-story house that's a box, and so it's all 2-story all the way around, but I have a hipped roof. So my plate height all the way around my house is much lower than if I had a gabled roof at one end. When you have a house that might have 2 sections, so you may have a 2-story box that comes up in one section, but then it drops down to 1 story, you have a 1-story nook extension. We allow the setback to be measured to individual building elements as we apply our setbacks on residential homes. And so that's kind of why, at least in part, why we've chose to apply setbacks to our accessory structures similarly to how we apply it to the residential structures, if that makes sense.
Because the ADU is not going to be a 2-story, so.
It's not an ADU.
No, just for accessory structures. ADUs actually are totally different. They could be 2-story, they just can't be taller than your main house, but ADUs have a separate set of setbacks, and that's really driven in part, Commissioner Hostler, by the compulsion that we're under to allow for ADUs and to allow for additional housing types. So we have, and I don't remember off the top of my head, but I believe it's a 5-foot side yard setback and a 10-foot rear yard if it's a 2-story. I think it goes up to 10 feet, otherwise it's 5 feet. So, and that's irregardless of the building height. We don't apply a sliding scale standard because essentially a premium has been put on ADUs, driven in large part by legislation that says thou shalt allow them and thou shalt remove barriers to allowing them because they provide a different housing stock for needs that have been identified throughout the state and in our community.
Well, okay, correct me if I'm wrong here, but we opened this conversation up with the ADUs, and you said wall setback.
Right. So with the ADUs, what we're adding to this language tonight is to clarify that accessory structures are not the same as ADUs.
Okay.
Because we have a separate section of our development code in our shared housing facilities that speak to both attached and detached ADUs and the standards that surround those. So we wanted to clarify that these standards we're talking about here are not the standards that apply to the accessory dwelling units.
Okay, now in construction, like here, people can wrap their mind around 24 feet. Okay, 24 feet. And then usually you say, okay, 8-foot wall, all right, is the average height from the inside and the outside. Okay, so when you said 8-foot wall, that's the outside.
Yes.
Okay. All right, there's something that didn't come around that I wanted to bring up, and that was the older manufactured houses. A lot of them have metal or aluminum siding. Now they could match that.
With the language as commission has directed us to shift, then I would say yes. The metal siding made to look like the wood siding would be allowed. Manufactured home parks and manufactured dwellings, if they're on a fee simple lot in a residential neighborhood, we have a certain set of design standards that go along with manufactured homes. In parks, manufactured homes, they are regulated a little bit differently because they're regulated by HUD standards and they're built in a factory. And there are specific design standards for manufactured homes in parks as well. They're not identical, but there are certain things in them that in our code, there's requirements for certain roofing materials and minimum pitches, minimum widths, minimum floor areas. They have to be built with HUD insignia, so post, I think 1978, I think is when those standards went into place. 76, thank you. Kim always knows. All housing questions. Go, Kim. So it is a little bit different, but I think with that language that we're adding, I think that would address your concern if I'm understanding what it is.
Yes. I do have another question.
Okay.
And that is, we were talking about section F and E. Okay, if there is no garage, okay, so, and then it goes on to say that if the garage is taken for the ADU, then how does the attached carport come into play, if at all?
A carport that's attached wouldn't come into play
Okay.
because it's considered, an attached carport is considered part of the primary home.
Okay, so then they could add on, when they do the ADU, they could add on a carport.
To the ADU or to the main house?
To the main house.
Theoretically, yeah. If they can meet setbacks, regardless of whether or not there's an ADU involved or not.
Okay.
So somebody could have a carport and a 750 square foot accessory structure if they didn't have a garage?
I think theoretically, yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
I think that makes sense.
I don't think there's anything that says they couldn't do that.
No, because it says garage.
Yeah.
So, okay.
And this predates me. I don't think I was at Planning Commission when we created that standard of the 750 square feet. But that was something in response to, there are some neighborhoods where the homes were not built with attached garages, or they weren't built with garages at all. And so when we had this limitation of only 600 square feet for an accessory structure, the idea was that if I have a house with an attached garage, it's a 2-car garage, 440 square feet, just kind of your standard 2-car garage, I can build a 600 square foot accessory building, not ADU, but accessory building in my backyard to do my woodworking, my garden tools, my bikes, whatever I want to put back in there, right? And if somebody has no garage and they're wanting to build a structure so they can house their cars, they would still be limited to only that 600 square feet, which really only gave them a net gain from their neighbor who has an attached garage of like 160 square feet or something like that. So the idea at that time, the direction that Planning Commission gave staff, and I don't know if staff proposed it or if Planning Commission brought it up, was to increase that allowance for an accessory building when there is no attached garage, to allow them a little larger building so it can accommodate cars and their stuff.
So, are you, sorry, are you good or?
Oh, yeah, I'm good.
So going back to what Commissioner Grants was talking about, which was the definition of the wall versus the building, correct?
Yeah. So I would suggest to the commission that under bullet point B, we add the definition that the maximum allowable building height is 24 feet, and that wall height shall be defined as the total height difference between finish grade and the highest point of the wall.
And would that wall height definition, would you want to put that in the setbacks section where we talk about the 8-foot wall height, Commissioner Grants? In C? Obviously the other option would be, and I didn't bring that section because frankly, I didn't even think about that, but when you brought that up, I'm like, yeah, I think you're right. I don't think there's a definition for wall height in there. Obviously, we've talked a lot of definitions lately. I remember our floodplain discussion.
Yep.
So it may be that if we want to create a definition of wall height, that we may need to put that in the definitions section 1.200. I'm looking a little bit here at the city attorney to get his opinion on that. I know he was pretty strongly opinioned on the last times we talked about definitions.
Yeah, we can play with that a little bit, whether,
Yeah, I'll let you guys
But-
decide that based on your notice requirements. I'm good with it either way. I don't
Okay.
think there's a lot of code sections where you're gonna be trying to define wall height.
so you were saying as measured from the finished grade level to the top of the wall?
Yes.
So I think, as we go into the motion on that, Mr. City Attorney, are you going to want something in there to include a definition for wall height in section 1.200?
No,
No? Okay.
I mean, I think your motion should just be to add the definition and allow staff latitude as where to put it.
Commissioner Keller?
Thank you. I am struggling with the definition of wall height. Because, again, you could have gable end wall, you could have square wall, or a flat roof wall. Doesn't include, we're not talking the height of the overall building, just wall height.
But it's measured as to which, that new sentence at the beginning of C.
Yeah,
So it's, in other words, if you visualize that shed in the corner of the backyard, you're only going to be concerned about the wall facing the side fence and the back fence.
yes, and it's a wall height, but then you could have an 8-foot wall and have another 8-foot ceiling. Right?
I'm sorry, you mean the roof?
Roof.
Yes, and that's a substantive question that
that's-
Shane and I discussed at length.
Yeah.
So I don't get into the policy thing, but even the current language allows a really tall accessory structure and really with no setback, theoretically, as long as the wall is only 8 feet. And if it's, 10 feet, it's only a 2-foot setback. But that's a policy question for you folks.
But then it goes on to say for every foot over 8 feet,
Right, so,
Only for the wall, though.
only for the wall, and that's what I'm
Right.
saying, is you could end up with a very tall roof on an 8-foot wall.
I could,
That could be used for storage.
right, yeah, if you did a hipped roof design, you mean?
Well, or
a gabled,
a very,
So-
a very steep gabled roof.
Sure, so let me clarify what the intent here is with the language, and there may be some wordsmithing, but since you guys are policy setters, I want to make sure I'm getting the direction from you all that you want us to approach. And again, I think maybe this will require some additional wrangling between the city attorney and myself to make sure the language says what I say it says, because I love what Commissioner Gren said, and give Shane the magic wand and just let him make the decisions. Perfect, no problem. But I also want to make sure I don't end up in court because I've made a decision that my city attorney says, what are you doing? So the intent here, Commissioner Keizer, is that if you have a gable end, we would want to look at that wall as being to the top of that gable. If you hipped the roof and dropped it down to where that roof is running away, I mean, frankly, it becomes a matter of geometry. So unless you're building like a 10-12 or a 12-12 pitch roof, by the time you get up to that height, you're running away from the property anyway with the setback. So that was the intent of the language, to say the wall that faces the property line is going to be farther away. So the gabled end is going to be farther away than the low gutter line end or side would be. That side would be able to be closer. The gable end would have to be farther away from that adjacent property line. Now, clearly, the peak is going to be up there to wherever the peak is. So yes, you're going to have a visual impact, but that roof line by the geometry is going to be running away from you if you're on that adjacent property looking at
Yeah,
it.
but it still can be made so high that your neighbor may not be able to see whatever they saw before. And, full disclosure, I'm one of these guys that has a 1,230-foot accessory building. And it's 19 feet tall. And it was built in 1996 before all this thing came in there. So I understand all that. And I had some neighbors that thought it was great, but the next neighbors that moved in didn't think it was so great having it so tall. So, I'm kind of sensitive to that. I don't want us to change this language to have it different than the language in the building code. I want us to be consistent. I don't see any difference between this and building the house on the same property as far as height restrictions and such. Am I missing something?
Well, in no case can accessory structure be taller than the main house ever, no matter what.
Or as tall?
Right. So, I mean, there is that provision, but I will say, I mean, so historically, actually, yeah, just, I think forever, even the old code, side yard setbacks for a primary house are 5 feet. Doesn't matter how tall it is. Doesn't matter if it's a 1-story or 2-story. It's 5 foot off the side yard. The rear yard has a larger setback, 20 feet
Yeah.
for two,
Well, I can
14 for one.
show you my plans that said with a firewall, I could have it on the property line. It's not, but.
Right.
You know.
And that is, and so clearly with accessory structures, we have always applied a different set of standards to accessory structures, I think in part from the theory that these are structures that are lower use, lower impact to adjacent neighbors than people living in it with lights on it and noise and all of those things. So I guess I'm looking for some direction from you all as to, okay, if we want to shift how we are applying setback standards, I'm going to need some clear direction on how, or if, I mean, at some point, if we need to be saying, okay, we got to bring back some different language to you to consider. If that's what we need to do, we can delve into that and do that. But again, my position, I guess, or my opinion on it would be, I was not intending to reinvent the wheel on how we have applied setbacks historically. I think for the most part, we've applied them fairly and equitably, and they've done what they're supposed to do. Now, do neighbors complain when somebody builds a shop in the backyard and it's right there next to them? Yeah, sometimes. But to be fair, when people partition their property and they can build a 35-foot tall house outright and have a 5-foot setback from a side yard, that's a way larger impact than any outbuilding you're going to put up at 600 square feet, even if it is as tall as your house. And we allow that outright. That's just, that's the process. So, I mean, I get where you're coming from on that, but I don't know that we need to greatly increase our setback requirement. But I'm with you. I also don't want us to take and say, okay, we're going to change this language so that the historical way we've applied how we regulate setbacks on accessory structures now give an ability for somebody to come in and drop down one wall height and then build a giant gabled upper area that is a huge mass, that's a big flat wall that goes up super tall. And that was truly the language is intended to say, where that wall is massed, that's how we're gonna measure that setback, either side. Does that
So
clarify?
how does the suggestion dovetail with what you said? How does the suggestion dovetail with what you said?
I'm trying to answer your question on the setbacks.
Yeah, I understand it, but I'm trying to understand the impact of his recommendation.
Jeremy's definition doesn't change anything. It just clarifies how to measure the wall. I think your point, Mark, is that there's a substantive question, at least maybe in your mind, if I'm getting it right, on, well, does it make sense to measure the setback based on the wall facing the property line, or should we look at the height of the building? Because the impact of the building, even with the roof running away from the property line, as Shane pointed out, is still kind of massive sometimes, depending on the design. So that's up to you guys. I mean, whether you feel like the setback should be based on the total height of the building, or should it be based on the wall. And granted, remember, that's not something we're changing. It's been like that for a while. So if you guys want to change it, that's fine, but we're not changing that. It just came up in the discussion, I think. So.
Okay, got it, thanks.
Okay. By the way, any other last thoughts or comments? All right, do we feel good about closing the public hearing on this?
Make sure no one wants to testify.
Wait, no, I don't see anybody. All right, we'll go ahead and close the public hearing at 7:06. And we'll move on to the discussion recommendation. So I guess first, is there anybody chomping at the bit to make a motion on this?
I move that we recommend approval to the city council, including some text changes that were discussed this evening. Section B, adding the maximum allowable building height, giving staff the flexibility to decide where they want to define wall height, with the definition that it shall be measured from the finished grade to the highest point of the wall.
I'm sorry, can I interrupt? What specific change in B?
Adding the word building between allowable and height.
Okay, thank you.
In section F, adding, for example, prior to wood, and adding and metal after and vinyl resin, prior to made to look like wood siding.
Okay, we got a motion on.
I'll second that.
Okay. Got a motion by Commissioner Granson, a second by Commissioner Keizer. Any discussion on motion? That phone line is pretty quiet. Okay, since there's no additional discussion, all those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed, same sign. Motion passes. Okay.
If we could double check, it appeared that we were just moving metal siding up into the categories, so that sentence would remain membrane structures
I think that's
are,
correct.
shall be prohibited,
Prohibited.
correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Even though I still, but I'm not gonna go there. All right. Next item, new old business staff report. What else have you got for us this evening, gentlemen?
Okay,
And Dina, sorry.
no problem.
I'm gonna get better at that. Apologies.
Yeah, so basically, we're kind of in a place where we have a lot of different things that we've been doing that have been going on for different possibilities of development. I think one thing, just as an update, the 7-Eleven/gas station in Area D of the Jug Handle, those permits were officially issued, I believe, today. So those came back from the county, and that's moving forward, so that's kind of exciting. There's been ongoing discussions with some possibilities for another possible amendment to Area D to accommodate a certain restaurant that wants to locate there and maybe shift how the building is laid out. So I've had several conversations with prospective developer there that seems to be moving right along. And then, we've got coming up into the next few months and new year, we've got several things that we will be talking about that we're bringing forward. We obviously, last month, we wrapped up the cost of growth on the transportation system, the housing needs and buildable lands inventory project for the update. I just had conversations with the consultant on that project here, I believe it was last week, and we are eyeing our February meeting will likely be shifted to do a joint work session with our city council, because planning commission and city council are going to be operating as our technical advisory committee on that project. And so they're looking at, I think it's February 8th, I believe. Thank you, Debbie. So that one it's held, but it's not 100% for sure yet. It's somewhat dependent on the developer. But yeah, other than that, I don't think I have anything grandiose to report on. I know that Chair Lawyer and I had a conversation today, with the mask requirements that are in place because of OSHA rules, and then the governor's freeze order on Monday night. And I don't know, maybe I should let Councilor Freeman speak to this, but the city council is choosing to move to Zoom in December for the December meetings, and individual commissions and committees have the decision-making authority in and of themselves to determine how they want to approach their future meetings. I know that from my end, we do not have a public hearing planned for the December meeting, so I'm going to defer to Chair Lawyer to kind of make a determination on what we want to do as far as our December meeting goes. And other than that, I don't think I have anything more for new and old business.
Mr. City Attorney.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So, I was going to say you probably don't want to hear more about COVID and OSHA and et cetera, but the question really is twofold. One, do you want to have a December meeting, or do you want to cancel that? But regardless of that, do you want to have your next meeting, whether it's December or January, via Zoom? And our preference is that you decide now, because we'd like decisions like that to be formal and on the record rather than a phone call or whatever. And the other comment I'd make, the OSHA rules, Occupational Safe and Health Administration, is what's causing the extra social distancing and masks here, because it's considered a workplace. OHA's rules and the executive order by the governor do not apply to local government buildings. So and the point, not only do we want to get it accurate, but more to the point, this is not going to go away in 2 weeks or whenever the freeze is over. The OSHA rules go until next May.
Oh, wow.
So, and there's talk that they'll probably have permanent rules after that, depending on the, pandemic status, right? So, but I didn't want anybody to be, get the wrong impression that this is just tied to the freeze and will go away when the freeze goes away. It's not like that. It's the OSHA rules are longer, so.
I mean, I think my personal opinion on it is, there's nothing wrong with suggesting a model similar to what the council's doing. I mean, I think if there's going to be things that are so potentially controversial or topic driven that we expect a larger public input, I think that's going to, frankly, be more accommodated via Zoom, unfortunately, than in person. My thought would be we just, as a policy recommendation for doing these during this pandemic, we could just model what the council's doing. That's just my own personal take on it. I'd be interested to hear what other folks have to say on that.
Yeah, if I can, just to make sure I'm not interrupting anyone. Matt, I would agree with you that just following the council's guidance and following their behavior would be a really reasonable step to take for us. And it would frankly give some automatic guidance to those who are tasked with setting up the meeting and setting up the Zoom as well, so they wouldn't have to worry about, well, we know what council's doing, but what is this commission going to do, or anything like that. But I'd also like to just confirm, are there any commissioners who are not set up to be able to do a remote meeting, Zoom or whatever we decide to do? I'll take that as a no.
No. I think, and I guess the question procedurally is, if you guys require specific notification DLCD on a lot of these amendments and stuff, if the council changes and you've noticed it as a Zoom meeting, but the council changes, then we're set up for Zoom, but in fact, we could have done it in person. Does that, I mean, that doesn't really create any issues, right? We would still just do it on Zoom and then come back to our regularly scheduled business the next meeting?
Right, we do it until further notice. Now, by the way, and I think it's mainly because the first meeting in January after election is kind of a big deal.
Right.
The council's motion on Monday night was to move all the December meetings, 2 regular meetings and 1 special meeting to Zoom, but meet in person again in January. And then they'll decide on whether to go back to Zoom. I presume they will. I suppose if they really have hassles with the Zoom meetings in December, maybe they'll consider it. But right now, their motion is to do the December meetings and then have the first meeting in January in person and make a decision on the future meetings then.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, if we model what the council's doing, obviously the January meeting, they're doing the one-off because of the new councilors and stuff. But if we need to do a January meeting in Zoom, because that's what the council is going to be doing for the rest of the month, that probably makes sense. It's tough because in January, that's going to be typically where we kind of look at the scope of the full year, and you do tend to get a little bit more of a read on folks in the situation when you're in person, but also we got to be kind of sensitive to the world we're living in right now. So Shane.
I was going to say, the other thing about the January meeting is that, I wasn't planning that we would be doing a public hearing in January because, as you just said, that's normally kind of we'll kind of talk about where we're at, what we've accomplished in the past year, and what we're tackling this next year. And generally, those are not public hearings. We won't have an action item before us. Obviously, if something changes and an application walks in the door tomorrow that comes to Planning Commission, that is a little different ballgame. And I think really the only thing that puts a monkey wrench into the works as far as just the nuts and bolts of making those meetings happen and how much lead time we need is that public hearing element.
Right.
So, I mean, the good news is the DLCD notices it's like a 35-day window. It doesn't actually matter what the hearing is. I just have to notice them that we're going to have a hearing. The bigger issue is, and what hit us this week when we had some inquiries about, are we going to move this meeting to Zoom tonight, is we had already put out notice on our website, in the newspaper, that it was a physical meeting, and we did not have any information in those notices as to how someone could participate via Zoom. So it would have put us sideways of kind of a procedural element, which the good news is for our January meeting, I do think we have a little bit of time that if we have to pivot in a short window, we can kind of go either way on that, just for that particular meeting.
So do we have general consensus, just kind of follow what the council's model is? Okay. Yes.
No, go ahead.
Okay. As far as December is concerned, I mean, it sounds like there's not a lot going on. I tend to err on the conservative side in that if Shane needs something because of a last minute permit, we just kind of play it by ear, especially if it sounds like you've got a possible text amendment coming up. But what do you guys think? Do we want to just call the December and wait till January, or do we want to kind of hold it for a couple weeks, and if Shane says he's got nothing, then we'll go ahead and cancel it?
Well, I mean, if we're going to be moving to Zoom anywhere, you can attend a Zoom meeting
In December,
just
right?
about anywhere.
Yeah.
So, and at a pretty short notice. So I would say if you,
Just hold the flexibility for you.
Okay.
whatever works for you.
Okay.
Plan on canceling it, but if it comes up,
Yeah, okay.
is that ambiguous enough for you?
For me, it's great. I'm looking to Shannon because I'm pretty laid back. I'm okay with rolling with it, but Shannon, is that okay with you?
Well, I guess the question is what would we have in December? You were talking about a text amendment?
There is the potential, right now, we would not be able to meet the notice requirement for December for that.
Let's just cancel December then.
So that would not be for a December meeting. I think the earliest that would happen would be January.
All right,
It
well,
sounds
let's
like
just
we
cancel
should
December
cancel
then.
it then.
Yeah, there is no public hearing that's been noticed for December, so it would be more of a background information going into the new year and any other updates that we may or may not have, depending on some of the other projects that are moving along.
Well, it sounds like you don't want to see us until next year.
Yeah.
I'm okay with that.
Nothing personal.
My office door is always open.
Or not,
Yeah, but just whether or not you're there is the problem.
And
Now I can go to Hawaii.
Anybody opposed to canceling December?
My only comment would be is if there's a potential text amendment set for January, that would put our potential work list into February.
Or we just have a longer meeting?
We can just have a longer meeting.
Cool. We'll plan on seeing you in January then.
Okay.
I know.
So the consensus is to cancel December meeting. Okay.
And to clarify the direction that you asked for, cancel December, and then we'll just follow the council's guidance on meeting attendance and participation.
Okay.
Is that helpful?
Yes.
All right, anything else? Do you got anything for us tonight? No? All right. Yeah, Frank.
This is not on the agenda, but there's something I'd like to bring up to Councilman Freeman, and that is, I don't know if the commissioners are aware of Salem's Climate Action Plan called Salem 350.
I personally didn't hear the first part of what you said, I'm sorry.
Salem's carbon neutral by 2035. It's called the Salem Climate Plan, I believe. And Salem has really taken off on this, and they just had a first meeting, and they have a number of people that are on that list. And I looked at the list, and Keizer isn't invited to none of these meetings. And so my thinking is that Keizer contributes to the climate action in the Salem area. So I would think that we would have people invited to the table. And so I just wanted to put that out to the commissioners and to the public and to Councilman Freeman that maybe we could invite ourselves to those meetings or find out if we could get to those meetings. You know, maybe the city
generally,
planner.
I think that if it's specifically related to environmental, I think that the public works director and the environmental staff may know about it more. In terms of the planning side, unless there's specific direction in terms of housing requirements and stuff like that, I don't think any of that really necessarily would fall into your wheelhouse, would it?
I think that, there's a couple things. There is, so the governor, I think it was an order, I think it was this year. So there was a governor's executive order, I think it's a 20 order. So there was a governor's executive order dealing with the climate change issue and greenhouse gas reductions statewide. And actually I am on a rules advisory committee for the state that I have some meetings coming up actually Friday and Monday. And that is basically some targeted greenhouse gas emission reductions that are targeted for this executive order. The Rules Advisory Committee meeting that I'm going to be a part of does include a bunch of other jurisdictions from the state. I believe the order, it's like a 14-page order, and it's been a while since I looked at it. I need to refresh my memory, but I believe it's specifically targeting jurisdictions that are over 50,000 people. But in that case, the Salem Keizer area is one of the identified areas because we're a shared UGB. We're sort of like an MPO, a metropolitan planning organization, but it's a little different, but it's similar. So we are actually at the table for those discussions. Now, those are specific for how the transportation planning rule, the TPR, is being affected by the order and some changes that are going to be proposed. And then also specifically looking at equity in transportation planning rules. A lot of big hot words are in this group that I'm a part of. And I'll find out more. I don't have much to report on because we haven't had any meetings yet, but I was showing Dina my giant stack of information that I need to get through and be educated on. But I do know, I am somewhat aware of Salem's goals for their carbon neutrality by 2035, and they're going through their really big look, there are Salem project, which is a massive comprehensive plan update. And they have had some specific direction from their elected officials to push forward in specifically greenhouse gas emissions and carbon neutrality and looking at that. We are not under quite the same compulsion from a state level because of our size, but we sort of are because we're captured in as an area. So yeah, I think it's difficult. I can absolutely reach out to the planning staff at Salem and get a little more information on it. I was just very surface aware of the work they were doing, but I from the discussions that I'd previously had with Eunice Kim, who's their long-range planning manager, and Lisa, who's the community development director there, I do think it's a pretty Salem-specific look, and the things that they are choosing to do from a policy perspective and how they're approaching it as their entity, whereas, we are clearly our own distinct governance and entity as well. And generally, any of those meetings that when they get into the public meeting realm, they are public meetings. So, yeah, I think that, and I would encourage you, if it's something that intrigues you or interests you, reach out and, yeah. So, is that helpful?
Yes, thank
Okay.
you.
All right. Okay. If there's nothing else, we'll move on to the city council liaison report. And Councilor Freeman, this is it. This is the last time we're going to see you as our council liaison.
What will you do? Someone else will join this group and
I'm going to email you every single public notice and just make sure you come to show up just for fun.
you never know. Not a lot. You did hear that the council for the month of December will be all Zoom. So our 2 council regular meetings and our work session. Just for note 2, we did have a work session scheduled for November 30th, and we have postponed that due to, if we're in a Zoom environment, the mayor would really like that particular meeting to be an in-person meeting, so we're postponing that. There is no West Keizer Neighborhood Association meeting for December. They always take December off. The tree lighting will be December 1st. At Wallery Plaza, but it is via Zoom only, so you can watch online. They will be hanging the lights this weekend along River Road and Shamala and Cherry. I think I've got all the streets covered. I said this at council, and I'll just say it again. If you're out as it's dark outside, please make sure you have lights on and you're reflective so people can see you walking, running, biking, and make sure your animals are have lights and reflectors as well. And next week is the Thanksgiving holiday, and wishing everyone a wonderful event on however you choose to celebrate. Thank you.
Well, I'll just take a minute to say thank you, Councilor Freeman. It's been a real pleasure having you as our liaison. You provided a tremendous amount of insight specifically on housing issues and things like that. And we'll just keep your number. That way we can text you during the meeting if we have any specific housing questions. But thank you. And, you're not gone yet, but you're gone from here. And thank you for all your years on council and all the wonderful dedicated time you've given to the city of Keizer. So I appreciate it. I think everybody else here does as well. Okay, Commissioner Grants, you're on for December 7th. Any issues with that?
No.
All right. Any other, by the ways, witty statements, remarks, comments?
Yeah.
Commissioner Keizer.
Thank you. I just wanted to dovetail and thank Commissioner, Councilor Kim Freeman for her service and her work, and also to remind folks that we still will have the Keizer Miracle Christmas Lights this year. It's going to happen. It starts the 4th. It goes through the 26th of December. It's a little different operation this year because of the COVID. There will be my understanding, there'll be a sign, a presentation at the normal drop site where there will be a QR code, and you can scan the QR code with your smartphone and donate to Marion Polk Food Share rather than bringing food. Now, that said, on the nights of, the first 3 nights, the 4th, 5th, and 6th, the chamber will be collecting food at Gupser, it's my understanding, at Gupser Elementary School, on the route to fill about 250 food boxes that they try to fill every year. So you have an opportunity to give twice. You can give with a QR code at the normal location, and then towards the end at Gupser Elementary, the chamber will be collecting food. The Keizer Women organization through the chamber, and so they can give out their about 250 food boxes. And the snow cops go up on Wednesday night, Wednesday afternoon, maybe Wednesday morning, depends on coffee.
Well, thank you, Commissioner Keizer. If there's no others, have a safe and happy Thanksgiving, and we'll see you back here next year. We stand adjourned at 7:31.